They came for everything we had. She had nothing left to lose. The dust came first. It always did. A brown curtain dragged across the horizon that smelled of scorched metal and something older. Something that had no name in any human language, because no human had ever encountered it before the Vrakthi arrived. Sergeant Mira Solano had been in the exclusion corridor long enough to know the difference between a wind event and a patrol column. Wind didn't leave thermal signatures. Wind didn't broadcast subharmonic suppression pulses that turned your back teeth into tuning forks. She pressed herself into the shadow of a collapsed water tower, the corroded steel cold against her shoulder blade, even through the ceramic plating that fused to her skin where the suit had decided, 17 months ago, to stop being a garment and start being something else entirely. Her left hand went to the junction point at her collarbone, the old reflex, the one the suit's neural integration had mapped in the first week and still hadn't overwritten, and she counted her breath. In, 2, 3, out. The Vrakthi column emerged from the dust wall in a staggered chevron, 6 ground units riding their grav sleds at 3 meters elevation, the anti-personal emitters on their torso clusters scanning in slow arcs. Behind them, taller, the command presence, what the survivors in the settlement called simply the Tall One. It walked on 4 limbs but stood when it chose to observe, unfolding to a height that made the ruined building facades look modest. Its sensory cluster rotated with a sound like a struck bell, faint and crystalline, and Mira's suit pinged a passive lock warning against the inside of her left wrist. She didn't move. The column passed 40 meters to her east. She watched through the tower's rusted grating, counting the interval spacing, noting the patrol pattern variance from the last time she'd logged them. They were getting tighter. 3 weeks ago, the sweeps had a 20-minute gap between passes. Now it was 11. Whoever or whatever was coordinating the Vrakthi push through this sector was learning. That was the part that scared her. Not the size of them. Not the weapons, which were elegant in a way she'd stopped finding beautiful after the first month. It was the learning. Humans learned faster. That was what they'd said at the briefing at the beginning, before the briefings stopped. She waited 4 minutes after the last grav sled faded to noise. Then she peeled out of the shadow and ran west, low and quick, the suit's exo-layer dampening her footfalls to nothing against the cracked concrete. She found the settlement by accident the first time 3 weeks ago. A cluster of pre-collapse HAB units shoved together on the leeward side of a processing facility that had been stripped of anything useful by someone meticulous and patient. The people inside had done the same kind of meticulous, patient work on survival itself. They'd sealed the gaps between units with layered ceramic insulation, harvested from somewhere she didn't ask about. They'd rigged a passive atmospheric scrubber from components she recognized and components she didn't. They'd survived 18 months in a Vrakthi exclusion zone, which was, by any metric she knew, impossible. Their name for themselves was simply the Settled. It wasn't defiant or proud. It was just accurate. The girl named Anne was the one who'd found Myra first, technically. She'd come around a corner at speed with a hand-fabricated crossbow at her hip, and stopped so fast, her boots squealed on the floor, and for 3 full seconds the two of them had just stood there staring at each other. Then Ani had said, very quietly, "You're real." Myra had not known in that moment what to do with that. She knew better now. "They came through the eastern marker last night," Ani said. She was sitting on an upturned coolant drum, cleaning the crossbow's trigger mechanism with a strip of cloth she'd been using for the same purpose. For so long it was probably doing more harm than good. Didn't take anything, just looked. "They're mapping," Mira said. She was on the floor, back against the HAB wall, working through the suit's self-diagnostic with 2 fingers. Some of the integration points at her shoulders were showing microfractures. The suit would deal with it in time. It dealt with everything in time. That was partly what frightened her. But the process wasn't comfortable. Passive survey before active acquisition. It's what they did in the Nakamura Basin before they cleared it. "Cleared it," Annie repeated. Her voice was flat, precise. "Yes." Annie set the crossbow down across her knees. She was maybe 19, maybe 22. Age was hard to read on faces that had spent too long in bad air and thinner rations. She had a scar along the jawline that she'd never explained, and eyes that processed everything they landed on, like she was committing it to an internal index. Her brother Wataru was older, quieter, and had been carrying something Mira recognized as damage ever since the night he'd come back from a supply run with 2 fewer people and 3 fewer words than he'd left with. "How long?" Annie asked. At this sweep cadence, 2 weeks before they have enough data to begin extraction. Maybe 3 if the weather stays bad. The weather won't stay bad. Mira looked at her. No, it won't. There was a sound from the back of the hob. Wataru moving through his nightly perimeter check. The small, reliable sound of him doing the only thing he could think to do when he couldn't sleep. Mira had been doing the same thing for 6 months before she ended up here, in this improbable place, with these improbable people, and she recognized it the way you recognized a shape in fog. Not with your eyes, with something older. There's a story, Aina said. The old ones tell it. About someone who comes from nowhere, who doesn't remember where they started, who fights anyway. She paused. I know you're not that person. Good, Mira said. I just wanted to say I know. Mira looked at her for a long moment, then looked back at the diagnostic readout. Get some sleep. You first, Ane said, and almost smiled. The suit had come from a facility she wasn't cleared to know the name of, built by engineers whose names had been redacted from every document she'd seen, and it had been doing something to her nervous system for so long that she couldn't remember clearly what the world had felt like before it. Not in a bad way, necessarily. More like, the suit had become fluent in her, and she had become fluent in the suit, and some of the original vocabulary on both sides had drifted. She remembered. Her mother's kitchen smelling of cardamom. She remembered. Laughing so hard at something her brother said that she'd spilled a glass of water and neither of them could stop to clean it up. She remembered the exact pressure of the first briefing when they'd told her that the Vrakthi weren't leaving, and the specific quality of silence in the room afterward. 17 people who'd all realized simultaneously that the word home was going to mean something different from now on. What she didn't remember, her serial number, her commanding officer's face, whether she had signed something at the beginning that had used the word permanent. The suit remembered everything. The suit kept logs she couldn't access. She'd made peace with that the same way she'd made peace with most things, by continuing to function. Billy was the settlement's oldest resident, and also its most irritating. He had an opinion about everything, delivered in a rasping continuous monologue, and Mira had privately cataloged his opinions as roughly 40% useful intelligence and 60% elaborate personal mythology. He'd been in the exclusion zone before it was an exclusion zone, which meant he'd watched the Vrakthi build their suppression grid from the beginning, and that 40% was genuinely irreplaceable. They bring a resonance unit through, you're done, he said. He was eating something that smelled of malt and salt and had the texture of old cork. Resonance unit, it broadcast wideband neural suppression, drops your coordination, clouds your judgment. The suit, he jabbed his finger at the ceramic plating over Mira's shoulder. It'll buffer you for a while. But they keep the frequency adapting. Long enough exposure, the buffer fails. I know, Mira said. You know, he repeated with the particular tone of someone who believes knowing and knowing are different. What does the resonance unit look like? Billy's eyes sharpened. He described it, a secondary emitter cluster mounted dorsally on a unit type she hadn't seen yet, four-limbed, lower to the ground, moving in support formation behind the tall one command units. She filed it in the index Anne had apparently been building behind her eyes, and which Mira had inherited through proximity. Can I take it down before it locks frequency? She asked. Billy chewed his cork food thoughtfully. Fast enough, maybe. Thing is, you take it down, every unit in a 2-click radius goes to high alert. You'd have maybe 40 seconds before the cordon tightens. 40 seconds is a long time. Billy looked at her with something that might have been respect, and might have been grief. In my experience, he said, 40 seconds is exactly how long it takes to know you've made a mistake. She found Wataru at the eastern perimeter at Zoo 200, sitting on a broken wall with his knees drawn up and a small flame lamp that he shielded with his body out of habit even though there was no wind. You should be inside, she said. So should you. She sat on the wall a meter away from him. The lamp threw yellow light across his profile. He had their father's cheekbones. Anne had mentioned once, in the careful way of someone selecting which memories to name aloud and which to protect. You were outside the wire when the column came through, he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was the observation of someone who had been counting and checking quietly, the same way she counted and checked. Yes, she said. And 11-minute sweep interval, tightening from the east. The next phase will be triangulation beacons. They'll want to lock the grid before they move. There's a unit type I hadn't seen before. Support configuration. I need to take it out in the first pass, or the whole engagement window closes. Wataru was quiet for a moment. The lamp flame leaned and steadied. Ane thinks you're the one from the story, he said. Annie said she knows I'm not. She says that. She believes otherwise. He turned to look at her. She has to. You understand that? She has to have something that means this continues to make sense. Mira looked at the lamp. What about you? He looked back at the dark. I think, he said slowly, that you don't know who you were before the suit. And I think the suit has been making decisions for a long time. And I think that might be the most terrifying thing about you, not the strength or the plating or any of that. He paused. I think you're learning to trust it. And I think you're going to need to stop asking whether you have the right to fight for us, and just fight. She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either, and after a while, Wataru lowered the flame lamp between them, like he was sharing something that cost him nothing and everything at once. The decision, when she made it, felt less like a decision and more like a direction she'd already been facing. She went to Billy, first for the updated patrol intervals he'd logged over the previous 4 days. Then she walked the settlement perimeter with Ane, and they counted the structural weak points and the strong ones, and Ane showed her the cache of chemical deterrents the settlement had built over 18 months. Not weapons, exactly, but things that could become weapons if someone knew how to position them. Here, Mira said, at the northeast gap between 2 HAB units. And here. She pointed to a drainage channel that ran behind the processor facility. If they come in a suppression formation, they'll funnel there. The channel walls are high enough to block the lateral emitters for approximately 4 seconds. Annie was sketching in a small notebook she kept in her left cargo pocket, the pencil moving in tight, efficient lines. 4 seconds. It's enough for a position shift, not enough for a retreat. We're not retreating, Annie said, without looking up. Mira looked at her. The girl's jaw was set, her shoulders slightly forward. Her weight balanced the way it was when she decided something, and closed the door behind her. Mira recognized it because she'd worn the same posture herself in a series of rooms she could no longer fully picture. No, she said. We're not. The Vrakthi came at dawn, not because they had intelligence on the settlement's watch schedule, Mira judged, but because dawn was when their own biological rhythm peaked, the sensory cluster at its most acute in the lower light frequencies of early morning. She'd watched them long enough to know. She'd watched them the way you had to watch something to survive it. Which meant she'd watched them the way you eventually, reluctantly, began to understand. She was in position on the processor facility roof when the first grav sled crested the eastern debris field. The suit was running full integration. She felt it as a kind of clarity. The world sharpened to its essential geometry, distance and velocity and structural integrity of everything in sight, resolved into numbers that lived in her peripheral vision without crowding it. The resonance unit was in the second rank, tucked behind a cluster of 4 ground units, right where Billy said it would be. The tall one was further back, still in the dust shadow of the debris field, its sensory cluster already turning in long, slow arcs. She had one shot at the resonance unit before her position was compromised. She took it. The suit's kinetic discharger ran from the integration points at her wrists outward. Not a weapon she'd been issued, not something with a manual and a service number, but something the suit had evolved in response to 11 months of contact scenarios, and she had long since stopped asking whose idea it was. The discharge hit the resonance unit's dorsal emitter cluster at 0.4 seconds from trigger. The unit went down hard, its emitter array venting in a cascade of white chemical smoke that smelled, she'd learned, of sulfur and something floral and deeply wrong. The cordon tightened, exactly as Billy had predicted. 40 seconds. She was already off the roof. The next 4 minutes were not something she would have been able to describe in sequence, even immediately afterward. The suit logged it. She knew the suit logged it. The experience from inside was less chronological and more spatial. A series of positions and pressures, and the very specific sensation of moving at the edge of what her body could survive, and the suit would allow. She took the first ground unit at the northeast corner of the settlement, using the drainage channel exactly as she described to Anne. The channel walls gave her the 4-second emitter gap. She used 2 of them. She took the second and third units in the gap between the HAB cluster and the processor facility, where Anne had positioned the chemical deterrents, and where the narrow corridor meant the Vrakthi couldn't flank without fouling each other's line-of-sight fire. Mira had stood in that corridor the previous afternoon and thought, This is what they don't understand. They were built for open ground, for the long engagement, where their sensor superiority paid out over time. Everything about their formation doctrine said space and duration. The settlement had neither, and had learned to make that a weapon. The fourth unit she misjudged. She was half a second slower than she meant to be. A microfracture at the left shoulder integration point had been degrading the neural response on that side since the previous night, and the suit's compensation hadn't fully recalibrated, and the unit's secondary impact weapon caught her across the left side of her torso with enough force to put her into the wall of the processor facility. She felt the ceramic plating absorb the first 80% of the impact and deliver the remaining 20 directly to her ribs in a way that made the next 3 breaths a calculated exercise in not stopping. She got up. This was the thing she had learned about herself. In 17 months of the suit and the exclusion zone, and the long education of surviving something that was not supposed to be survived, she got up. Not because she had calculated that it was strategically optimal, not because the suit prompted her. She got up because the alternative was lying down, and lying down had never once felt like something she was capable of. She took the fourth unit. The tall one was still in the dust shadow. She'd expected it to commit earlier. That was the pattern the Vrakthi command units followed: suppress the perimeter, and then advance on the identified threat to conclude the engagement. But this one hadn't moved. Its sensory cluster was tracking her, had been tracking her since she came off the roof, and as she stood in the rubble of the northeast perimeter with 4 downed units and her left side making a sound on every exhale that she chose not to categorize, she understood why. It was learning. It had watched her take 4 units, and it had recalculated. She was not a drone strike to be absorbed and compensated for. She was something else, and the tall one was in the process of deciding what. She walked toward it, not ran, walked. Slowly. Through the debris and the chemical smoke from the resonance unit's vented array, across the cracked ground of the exclusion zone that had been a district road once, and would be something else later if there was a later. The suit's diagnostics scrolled in her peripheral vision. The microfractures at the shoulder, the impact compression on her left ribs, the kinetic discharger at 63% charge. The tall one unfolded to its standing height as she came within 20 meters. It was looking at her, the way it must have looked at everything it was trying to solve. She stopped. They looked at each other for a moment that felt longer than the diagnostics said it was. Then the tall one's posture shifted. A subtle reorganization of its 4 lower limbs, weight redistributing, sensory cluster dropping to a lower angle. Combat posture. Final decision made. Okay, Mira said, to no one in particular. To herself. To the suit, maybe. To the part of her that still remembered cardamom and spilled water and laughter in a kitchen that no longer existed. She charged the discharger to full and went in. The fight with the tall one lasted 1 minute and 40 seconds. She knew because the suit logged it, and because Ane had been watching from the processor facility roof with a hand-fabricated periscope. And afterward, Ane said it had lasted 1 minute and 40 seconds, and sometimes corroboration was its own kind of comfort. What she remembered from inside it. The tall one was faster than the ground units. It had been holding that back. When it committed fully, and for the first 30 seconds she was purely reactive, using the suit's speed advantage on direction change to stay out of the reach of its impact limbs, which were long and dense with kinetic mass. It was trying to pin her. She understood. Trying to create the situation where it could bring its full weight to bear and simply end the problem by compression. She stopped running from it. She had calculated in the microseconds before doing it, either the correct read or the last thing she would ever calculate. But the tall one's entire approach was predicated on her continuing to retreat. It had mapped that behavior over 2 minutes of observation. It had optimized for it. She stepped inside its reach. This close, she could smell it. The Vrakthi had a smell like hot glass and old lightning, and the tall one was close enough that she could see the individual facets of its sensory cluster, each one independently tracking her, each one adjusting. She put the discharger's full charge into the juncture between its sensory cluster mount and its primary body, the spot that her 17 months of watching and logging and the suit's 11 months of threat modeling had identified as the point of highest neural density. The tall one went still, not down, still, like someone in the middle of a thought that had suddenly become very difficult. Then it went down. The smoke took a long time to clear. Anna found her sitting at the edge of the northeast perimeter, back against the hab wall, diagnostic scrolling. The settlement was intact. The Vrakthi column's transponders had gone dark. The ground units, the resonance unit, the tall one. No secondary sweep had materialized in the 4 minutes since the engagement ended, which meant either the patrol had been operating without immediate relay, or the relay was waiting to confirm status before triggering escalation. Either way, they had time. Not much, but time. Ane sat down next to her without being invited, which was very much in keeping with Ane. "You're hurt," she said. "Left ribs, compression. The suit will manage it." "Does it hurt?" Mira considered the question honestly. "Yes," she said. Ane nodded, as if this mattered to her specifically, as if pain was a credential she had been waiting for. Then she pulled the small notebook from her cargo pocket and opened it to a fresh page and sat with it against her knees, not writing anything, just holding it. "The story says the ironclad savior doesn't remember where she came from," Ane said. "That she woke up already armed. That she doesn't know if she deserves to be what she is." She paused. "I used to think that was the saddest part." Mira looked at her. "Now I think it's the bravest part," Ane said. "To keep going anyway, when you don't know your own origin. When you don't know if the thing you're carrying is a gift or a sentence." She looked at the smoke-blurred horizon. "To just choose the people in front of you and fight." Mira was quiet for a moment. The suit's diagnostic pinged a minor alert and then resolved it without her input. The smoke drifted east. "What does the story say happens to her?" she asked. "After." Ane considered this. Different versions say different things. In some, she leaves. In some, she stays and they build something. She turned the notebook over in her hands. In some, she finds out who she was and it doesn't change who she is. "Which version do you prefer?" Aina smiled, a full one this time, unguarded, the age in her face briefly retreating. "I prefer the one where she has breakfast first and we figure out the rest later." Mira looked at her. The smoke, the damaged perimeter, the settlement behind them, intact, its improbable occupants already moving. She could hear them, already assessing and reinforcing and doing the meticulous patient work that had kept them alive when nothing should have. She stood up. The left ribs protested. She factored the protest into her next step and the one after. "Show me where the kitchen is," she said. Wataru was already there, which she'd half expected. He'd made something from the settlement stores that involved heat and time, and smelled like something she almost recognized. Not cardamom, exactly, but adjacent to it. In the family of things that meant morning, and someone thought of you while they were doing this. He handed her a bowl without ceremony, and sat back down and didn't ask about the ribs, which she appreciated. Billy was at the far end of the space, eating his cork food, and pointedly not acknowledging that his 40-second estimate had been used to win something. She filed that under the 40% useful intelligence column and let it go. Outside, the exclusion zone hummed with Vrakthi transponders on frequencies the settlement's sensors could track but not disrupt. The grid was still live. The tall one had been one column, one pass, one morning's worth of the Vrakthi's patient. Incremental, learning, advance. There would be more. There would be the question of what the relay reported, what the higher command tier calculated, what came next. She ate the food Wataru had made. It was good. It was warm in a way that reached the old vocabulary, the part of her that still spoke in kitchens and laughter, and the specific weight of mornings that mattered. The suit ran its diagnostics. The microfractures at the shoulder, actively repairing. The rib compression, managed. The kinetic discharger, cycling back to full charge. She didn't know who she'd been before the suit. She had made peace with that, mostly. What she knew was this settlement, these people, this bowl of something warm in her hands, and the particular quality of morning light coming through a gap in the hab wall that threw a stripe of gold across the floor where Ane was sketching in her notebook. And Wataru was watching the door, and Billy was eating his cork food with the expression of someone who was very carefully not being moved. She knew that the Vrakthi were learning. She knew she was too. She knew that the gap between those two facts, the delta, the margin, was what she had to work with, and that humans, stubborn, loud, warm, improbably durable humans who turned drainage channels into tactical assets and built atmospheric scrubbers from salvage and kept notebooks and made hot food for people they'd known 3 weeks. Humans were very, very good at making the margin work for them. Outside, the dust came again, the familiar brown curtain, the smell of hot metal. She finished her breakfast, then she went to work.